What's happening, gang? With a guitar like riff like that, you must be back in the stash, and Steve must be in the cockpit. What's happening, gang? Real Talk Radio San Diego, tracking down some cool local people, talking about some important local stuff. And in the house today, we got Kenneth Stone, Stone Law Group. Talking, real estate game, sure. You'd like to believe it always goes well, but unfortunately, things break, the wheels fall off. And luckily for us, we got a man like Ken Stone, hopefully in our corner. And by the way, if you want to catch Ken in all of his glory privately, okay, where he's not making Stash Nation a little brighter than how he found it, you can catch him at thestonelawgroup.net, or you can call him at 619-233-1818. Ken, let's get right back into this, man. The context for the day, real estate litigation, how to avoid it, how to deal with it. So let's do just that. So let's start with buyers. So what's like after all of your infinite wisdom, like what's the thing that you just keep seeing popping up over and over again where you're like, man, if you just would have done that. Let's start with the buyers.
Well, I think buyers can supplement the disclosures that they get from the seller and the inspection that they may hire somebody to do by doing a little bit of their own investigation.
Okay, good.
So there are a couple of things I highly recommend, especially in a residential transaction. I mean, you're going to be generally moving into a neighborhood where everything may look good on the outside, but don't you want to know who your neighbor is? It's a good idea not just to drive around the street and go into the house that you're going to buy, but knock on the doors on both sides and find out who you're going to be moving in next to. And sometimes even ask some questions of your future neighbor as to whether they've noticed anything unusual going on at that property. The other thing that a buyer can do is they can...
Well, hold on, let me stop you real quick. So, what would that reveal?
Well, let's say there's been a flood at the house and it hasn't been disclosed. But somebody saw a remediation vehicle in front of the property.
I'm going to give you a point for that, my man.
Thank you. Or they just know from our neighbors know what's going on with their neighbors a lot of times. So you find out things that sometimes haven't been disclosed that can save you a lot of heartache down the road.
You know, one that comes up for me, actually, I don't really know how it would have changed anything per se. I don't think it would have made the person not buy the house. But we helped a buyer up in Normal Heights. This is probably about 2 years back or whatever. Beautiful little, just an adorably gorgeous little bungalow. Got in, and they moved in. Everything was just so picturesque. Literally a week and a half after they got the keys, FBI in the door. Knocked it down. Well, I don't know if they knocked it down, but it was like a whole SWAT team kind of thing. They roll inside. They got like a little baby, panicking. Like, what in the world? Apparently, the seller's son was hooked up in some bad drug stuff, and the FBI was like late to the game or something. Mm-hmm. And so it already transferred hands. It was kind of a lame move on the FBI. I think they would have checked that there was a change of ownership a week and a half ago. But still, though, it was one of those things where it's like, God, if only you would have known that.
That's true. And that's something that a neighbor might have noticed unusual activity at the house and might be willing to disclose that where the owner himself wouldn't.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, good. Anything else?
Well, the other thing I recommend buyers do is, today with the internet and public databases, there's so much available online. So I always recommend that a buyer do two things. They can go into the San Diego Grantor Grantee Index and look up the seller's name, which can oftentimes disclose whether there was any unusual lien or judgment against the property, or they can go into the San Diego Superior Court website and do a case search and find out if the seller's been involved in litigation before. Sometimes that litigation could have concerned the very property that they're purchasing. And those are things that wouldn't normally be part of a disclosure, nor something that the real estate agent would normally have to look at and disclose as part of the agent's responsibilities.
What was the first site you said?
I don't know the exact name of the website, but if you were to Google San Diego Grantor Grantee Index, it would take you into the county recorder's records, and then you have the ability to do a name search by first and last name. It doesn't work very well when you have a common name like John Smith, but if you have an unusual name, oftentimes you can isolate the very person you're looking for, and you'll find out whether there are any liens or a list pendants that's been recorded against the property, something that would alert you to prior litigation.
Something that could blow up.
That's right.
The transaction. Yeah. Yeah, well said. I love that. I'm going to give you another point for that, my friend. That was good.
Thank you.
I knew about the SD Superior Court one. Never heard about the grantor grantee one.
Well, you probably don't need to use it because you probably have access to your own title company database.
Sure.
But for members of the public who don't have that kind of access, it's available.
Right. And we do rely heavily on that kind of stuff, too. And, yeah, there's an abdication that goes on, but still it's like you want to empower your clients with as many different resources and tools as possible, right?
That's right.
I love that thought. I'm going to install that into my system this week, my friend. So you're already leaving me better than how you found me. I can't imagine what you're doing to Stash Nation right now. So anything else for buyers before we move to the other side of the court?
I would just say don't hesitate to ask questions. If you have questions of the seller, whether you can deal directly with the seller or through their agent, get any questions answered. Don't leave any stone unturned.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that. Well said. And you mentioned it best. I'll put as a punctuation on the buyer's side of the court, which is there are definite limitations to the disclosure process from sellers. It doesn't tell the whole story when things fall outside the margin. And how often can we all agree that things happen to fall outside the margin, right?
That's right.
Oh, that's life. It tends to get in the way. Okay, so let's hop over then. So what about sellers? So what are some things that sellers can do to avoid litigation?
Well, first and foremost, I think we talked about it earlier, but making a full and complete disclosure is very important. Anything that you think could materially affect the property that's being sold, you're better off disclosing it and suggesting to the buyer that they conduct their own inspection than holding it back, because that's oftentimes where problems arise.
No question.
The other thing that I recommend sellers do is one of the mistakes a seller can make is if they sell the property to a buyer who has a history of being litigious. In other words, maybe you don't want to sell your property to somebody who has a history of filing lawsuits. So just as I said earlier, a buyer can look up a seller's background. A seller can do the same thing and look at the Superior Court website and make sure they're not selling the property to somebody who is most likely going to file a lawsuit against them over something minor.
It's interesting, right? I love that. Might put a little bit more time in the negotiation process, but might be time well spent.
That's right.
Because once you sign that contract as a seller, it's very difficult to unravel. Buyers have all kinds of different ways to get out of the contract and all parts of their discovery process. Seller, it's kind of like once you get that in writing, you're kind of pot committed.
Well, you are. Unless there's some contingency that allows you to back out, once you sign the contract, you're going to have to convey the property or pay damages.
Well said. Anything else for sellers?
Not that I can think of at the moment.
So, hanging out with Kenneth Stone, owner proprietor. What would you title yourself there?
Well, it's my office. I have several associates, but my name's on the door.
My name's on the door. I love it. That should be your title. Ken Stone, my name's on the door. Stone Law Group. You can catch him, by the way, at thestonelawgroup.net or call him anytime at 619-233-1818. One of the things that you said during break, actually, which I thought was really cool, is, in our game, meaning helping folks in the real estate capacity, getting into and out of homes, there is a very quick ceiling about, I call it the pay grade, things that we can advise our clients on. And very often things fall outside of that fold, right? And I find myself saying all the time, hey, you should talk to a CPA about that. Talk to a lawyer about that. So if you were a buyer and you're going through a very traditional and typical situation, are there a couple things that you would recommend that they should always talk to counsel about that, I don't know if this is necessary to avoid litigation, but just more to protect their bums?
Well, I don't think in California, at least, I'm not sure that a lawyer is necessary in every real estate transaction. But if there are potentially tax implications or something unusual that comes up in the preliminary title report that might require additional analysis, you've got an unusual easement that appears in the preliminary report. It might be beyond the expertise of the realtor to analyze it, or something involving boundaries, then those are the situations where it's useful to have a lawyer involved.
That's a really interesting element, too. We weren't planning on talking about today, but since it kind of came up, these plot lines, that basically the only evidence that a buyer gets in a traditional conversation of acquiring a property is like something that a third grader looks like they sketched up on a crayon. It's like you can kind of make out landmarks like, oh, there's my street. Oh, there's the neighbor. Oh, that must be my house. But like you actually have to hire like a surveyor to actually go out there if you want the specifics of whether or not that fence that was built back in 1950 is actually on my property by a foot or not, right?
That's right. Sometimes it's an issue because you're in a community, especially older communities, where the parcels are larger, and it may be harder to assume where the boundary line is correct. Mm-hmm. In tract developments, it's generally not as much of an issue, right. But that's an area where, if a lawyer were consulted, he would probably in turn get a civil engineer involved to actually make sure he found the monuments and that the boundaries are where they're supposed to be.
Yeah, civil engineer. Yeah, the concept of grandfathering. Now, this is something that I think gets thrown around all too often as if people know what they're talking about when it comes to the grandfather. And first of all, what am I even talking about? Like, what's the concept of grandfathering when it comes to property?
Well, it means that generally that there was some condition going back a number of years that was legal at the time, but if it were to be recreated today, it would violate an ordinance or a statute.
Yeah, so thank you, by the way. So how does that play out? Like, for example, someone buys a property, whatever now, and there's some, let's just call them funky stuff going on, and then they want to go do some improvements to the house, and they want to get the county or the city involved or whatever, do it by the book, and then all of a sudden this shows up.
Well, it depends. So, for instance, we had a situation recently where a client was remodeling a duplex, and he needed to leave the rear wall in place in order to be able to use the existing footprint because the setbacks had changed. So if that wall had been knocked down, and that's what happened actually inadvertently, the contractor took it out. That changed his requirements with the city. So you have to be cognizant of those kind of situations and work around them.
That is about as much fun as death at a birthday party, to get that call from the contractor.
Right, because in that case, it affected the number of square feet that the client could build on.
Wow. Yikes. That would not have been a fun phone call to be on. That would have changed. I mean, come on. That basically changes the entire valuation of the property, etc.
It did. It affected the relationship between the owner and his contractor and created issues with the city. It became a real legal puzzle that had to be worked through. Imagine
that. Imagine that it would have caused problems between the owner and the contractor. Hard to believe. My man Kenneth Stone hanging out live in the Secret Stash. You can catch Kenneth in his private glory over at thestonelawgroup.net, or you can call him old school style at 619-233-1818. Again, that number is 619-233-1818. We'll get you caught up on a little sports commentary. After all, this is ESPN, Ken. So get that going from our gang over at CBS. And then coming up, mediation provisions. Now, we're going to kind of get into the weeds a little bit of the contract right now, but this is a big one, and that's why we got my man Kenneth Stone live in the Stash. Real Talk Radio San Diego. We'll be right back.